Welcome to today's Explainer. If you grew up thinking early America was just this simple, straightforward story of English settlers arriving on a completely empty coast, well, prepare for a major perspective shift. Today, we're going to discover that early America was actually a fierce, incredibly crowded geopolitical chess match. All right, let's dive right into this. So, what exactly happens when the world's absolute most powerful empires just crash into each other on a single continent? That is the core question we are tackling today. We aren't just looking at one nation's neat little story here. We are looking at a massive collision between rival European empires and these incredibly powerful, sovereign native nations. Everyone is vying for wealth, dominance, and survival, and honestly, their interactions fundamentally reshaped the globe. To make sense of this packed historical stage, here is our agenda for the Explainer. Number 1, Spain's violent Florida frontier. 2, the French fur trade. 3, Dutch commerce in New Netherland. 4, the Haudenosaunee Great League. And 5, Portugal's sugar and slave trade. All right, Section 1, Spain's violent Florida frontier. The quest for wealth and the reality of resistance. Back in the early 16th century, Spain was the dominant European power, and they were driven by a massive quest for wealth. They had their eyes on the southeastern coast of North America, a region they called Tierra de Allian. This area inspired some really early and often entirely disastrous Spanish expeditions. For example, in 1539, Hernando de Soto landed an army near Tampa Bay, just ruthlessly searching for the kind of massive metropolitan wealth the Spanish had already found among the Aztecs and Incas. Well, spoiler alert, he didn't find it. Instead, he spent 4 years pretty much ransacking native communities. But here is the absolute key takeaway. Native peoples were not passive victims in this. They actively opposed, avoided, and purposely misled these Spanish expeditions just to get the soldiers out of their territories. Spain's grip here was incredibly tenuous. To try and lock down some actual control in Florida, Spain relied heavily on a super exploitative mission system, and that sparked massive blowback, like the 1656 Timucuan Rebellion. The Spanish missions demanded extreme labor and resources from native headmen. Friars aggressively prohibited native religious practices, and honestly, they were rightfully blamed for the devastating European diseases that were wiping out native populations. In response, the Timucuans organized a powerful alliance and attacked the Spanish. But in a really tragic twist of native geopolitics, another powerful native group, the Apalache, actually sided with Spain, helping to crush the Timucuan rebellion. It really goes to show that Spanish power in Florida depended entirely on native alliances. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the intense religious and political chaos of the Reformation meant Spain's rivals were watching these New World conquests very closely. And this brings us to a crucial concept, the Black Legend. This was essentially anti-Spanish historical propaganda, heavily focusing on Spanish atrocities against native peoples. The propaganda of the time was stunningly horrific. Think of intense graphic engravings depicting Spanish forces feeding native people to dogs. English and Dutch writers who were obviously motivated by their own political and Protestant religious goals gleefully circulated these types of images and reports. Why? Basically to frame themselves as the good guys. They argued that a benevolent, non-Spanish conquest of the New World was desperately needed. It was the absolute perfect humanitarian justification for their own imperial invasion. Moving on to Section 2, the French fur trade, cultivating cooperation for commerce. So how exactly did Spain's rivals approach colonization? Well, the crucial difference is that the French desperately needed Native Americans. Unlike the Spanish, who were hunting for gold, the French economy in Canada and the Great Lakes totally relied on the fur trade. They needed skilled Native American trappers to get those incredibly valuable beaver pelts. So while Spanish Franciscans brought natives into enclosed, highly controlled missions, the French Jesuits adopted a totally different conversion strategy. They actually lived with or alongside indigenous people. The French basically created what historians like to call a middle ground, a space of cross-cultural negotiation and accommodation, largely because, frankly, they simply didn't have the numbers to conquer by force. This strategy actually led to incredibly deep cultural integration. It gave rise to the métis, a term literally meaning mixed, because it became super common for French fur traders to marry Native American women, intertwining their lives, kinship networks, and economies. This intersection of cultures and religions produced some profound stories. Take Kateri Tekakwitha, born in the 1650s to a Mohawk man and an Algonquian captive. She survived a devastating smallpox epidemic, converted to Catholicism under French missionaries, and subjected herself to intense religious suffering. Her deep devotion eventually led to her being canonized as a Catholic saint in 2012. It's just a powerful testament to how deeply Native and European worlds were merging and colliding in New France. Okay, Section 3, Dutch Commerce in New Netherland, Capitalism, Wampum, and Early Slavery. Further south, another empire was busy making its mark. The Dutch were arguably the most advanced capitalists in the modern world at this time. I mean, they had the Amsterdam Stock Exchange and the Dutch West India Company. They arrived in New Netherland, which is modern-day New York, purely to trade, not to conquer. And to tap into existing native networks, they utilized wampum. These were shell beads created by native women, originally meant for specific ceremonial and diplomatic purposes. But in the hands of the Dutch, wampum was transformed into a literal colonial currency. They used it to buy beaver pelts, and as the famous story goes, Peter Minuit used European goods to legally purchase Manhattan from the Munsee people in 1626. The Dutch wanted to follow the legal philosophy of Hugo Grotius, who argued native peoples actually had natural rights, but these transactions usually just highlighted a massive misunderstanding of property between the two cultures. But by the year 1660, New Amsterdam held a really dark record. It had the largest urban enslaved population on the North American continent. The Dutch loved to boast about their liberties and religious tolerance back in Europe, but make no mistake, their capitalist empire relied heavily on the brutal enslavement of Africans. Now, the system in early New Amsterdam did feature some complex legal pushbacks, leading to a really unique status known as half-freedom, when several enslaved people owned by the West India Company actually fought to defend the colony against native attacks. They petitioned for their freedom and won this unique status. They were allowed to work their own land, provided they paid a pretty large tax or tithe to their enslavers. But the tragic paradox here is that the children of these half-free laborers remained fully enslaved by the company. It's a stark reminder of how economic goals quickly crowded out any cultural or religious objections to slavery among the Dutch. Let's pivot to Section 4, the Haudenosaunee Great League, Native Geopolitics and the Morning Wars. We really need to shift our focus entirely away from the Europeans for a minute. Native Americans were absolutely not just reacting to European empires. They were playing their own high-stakes geopolitical games. The five nations, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk, together formed the Haudenosaunee, or the Great League of Peace. Initially, this was a powerful religious and political coalition designed to stop a vicious cycle of internal violence among their own peoples. By creating nonviolent means of conflict resolution internally, they established themselves as an absolute powerhouse in the Eastern Great Lakes. But here's the thing. Peace within the League did not mean peace outside of it. The Haudenosaunee suddenly found themselves cut off from vital European trade routes by other native nations. And to make matters worse, they were being decimated by new epidemic diseases like smallpox. This triggered a massive escalation of what are called mourning wars. To ease the immense grief of their matrilineal households and literally replace the population they were losing to disease, they ruthlessly raided neighboring nations to take captives, eventually adopting them into their own families. And the ripple effect of this strategy was just staggering. We see a rapid succession of conflicts unfolding one after another, starting in 1624 with the Mohicans, sweeping through the Wendat in the 1640s, all the way down to the Eries in 1657. In their intense drive to control trade and replace their population losses, the Haudenosaunee turned outward with immense force. They literally scattered dozens of other native nations across the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley, proving for sure that they were a dominant empire-level force in early America, entirely on their own terms. Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Portugal's sugar and slave trade, global rivalry in Brazil. Let's zoom out a bit to see the true global scale of this clash. Long before other European powers set up shop in North America, the Pope had actually intervened way back in 1494 with the Treaty of Tordesillas, essentially dividing the non-European world between Spain and Portugal. Portugal took the territory that eventually became Brazil. And two massive industries powered this colony, sugar and the transatlantic slave trade. The wealth generated here was off the charts. In fact, over the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade, more Africans were enslaved and brought to Brazil than to any other colony in the Atlantic world. All of that immense wealth made Brazil a massive target, setting the stage for some serious global imperial warfare. Remember those capitalist Dutch we talked about earlier? Well, they wanted to dominate the global sugar and slave trade too. They literally invaded Brazil, successfully conquering the northeastern portion in 1630. And they didn't stop there, they even seized Portuguese slave trading ports over in Africa. But resistance in Brazil was fierce, coming not just from Portuguese colonists, but also from free people of African descent. After decades of constant, grueling global warfare over these human and natural resources, the Portuguese finally ousted the Dutch from Brazil in 1654. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. Were European powers shaping the New World, or was the New World actually shaping them? As we've seen today, early America was absolutely not a blank slate waiting to be painted by European empires. It was a chaotic, incredibly dynamic arena where native geopolitics, European religious rivalries, relentless capitalist ambitions, and the tragic brutalities of the slave trade all collided. Native nations and competing empires fundamentally transformed each other in a massive struggle that would define the modern world. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning the history you think you know, and I'll catch you next time.